Bart, thank you for coming down, making the journey from Salt Lake City. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
You bet. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So, Bart, you are the Senior Vice President of Marketing for the Utah Jazz.
How about that?
How about that? That has to be a really fun gig.
It has been. It's been really a bit of a dream come true. I don't know that I ever had my sights set on that per se, or thought that it was really an option. But it's been a fun path to get to this point.
Well, let's talk about that path because you've been with the Utah Jazz since 2015. Before that, I mean, it was still Utah Jazz. It was the Salt Lake City Stars. Mm-hmm. You were the general manager, but you've been affiliated with Larry H. Miller, which, if anyone wonders, Larry H. Miller has been the owner of the Utah Jazz for how many years?
Utah Jazz, he's been bought 50% back in 1985.
Okay.
And then the other 50% in the year after.
Yeah, so I feel like whenever it was, for a long time that I went to games, you would always see Larry H. Miller
front row
there. And he's quite a presence here. He's since passed away, but all of his dealerships. But you've been affiliated with Larry H. Miller since 2010.
Correct.
Tell me about that journey.
Yeah, that was interesting. I had a previous life in the real estate and new home construction industry. But realistically, I went through a kind of the difficult years there. We had some great years. I think I started back in 2003 in real estate and worked for a local home builder, sales and marketing, moved up to Idaho for a while, started a new housing division for us up there. It was fantastic. It was 650 acres. Up just outside of Boise in Eagle, Idaho. We had a Jack Nicklaus Golf Academy, a Mia Hamm, Brandy Chastain, Julie Foudy Soccer Academy.
Beautiful, yeah.
Mark Spitz Swim Academy. It was great. Then the market turned on us. And so we went through a couple of years of some challenges, especially up there in the Boise market. And through that period of time, I was moving back and forth from Utah. I was actually working in Utah, and my family was back in Boise. So I finally got to the point where I'm like, you know what? Let's look for something different. It's time to move on. And so, quite frankly, I took a few months off, not knowing what I wanted to do. But I kind of had my eyes set on the Larry H. Miller Group. I'd heard a lot of great things about it. And so I was lucky enough to get an interview for their advertising agency. They own, the Larry H. Miller Group owns over 80 businesses there. And so I ended up coming in and working for their ad agency, which they manage all the advertising plans for the 55 some odd dealerships, as well as for all the entities within the organization, and then a handful outside. And so I spent my first 3 years there doing a variety of things, but primarily overseeing the advertising plans for all the individual dealerships there, which was a lot of fun.
Pretty intense gig, right?
Very intense. If you imagine, I had basically 55 GMs that I answered to, and if you've been
make happy,
yes, and if you've been a part of the car industry, it's a pretty demanding personality.
Yeah.
But I love that part of it. I thrive in the fast-paced environment. That's what I really like, and it's a fascinating industry, quite frankly. But after a little while there, I got the call and said, hey. There were some adjustments and switches at one of our other companies, Fans Sports Retail. We owned 121 different stores across 22 different states across the country. And they asked me to come out there and be their VP of marketing. And so I looked at that as an opportunity to kind of expand my horizons and went out there and not too far after I was with Fans, they also asked me to overtake their buying. Oversee their buying department, which I had no experience in buying. But I think throughout my career and through my experience, where I've been able to find ways to thrive is to just kind of dig in and figure out what needs help, what the issues are, and try and solve for that.
Yeah, make everything figure outable.
Yeah, that was probably the toughest couple years of my life. It's a very complicated industry. You're focused on inventory product for specifically sports retailer, where you might have a player that gets traded. You have to buy 9 to 12 months in advance of a season. So for this upcoming basketball season, we would be buying back in February. And you don't know who's on the team. You don't know how well the teams are going to do. So it's a complicated industry, but it was fun. And then not too long after that, like I said, I was there probably a little less than 2 years. Then I got a call from the Jazz side of things. And they said, hey, we're restructuring over on our marketing department. And we'd love you to come over and be vice president of marketing services. So I oversaw our digital practice, our analytics practice, and our design team. And realistically in that, within Larry H. Miller Sports and Entertainment, at the time that was providing services for the Jazz, for the Salt Lake Bees, for Megaplex Theaters, the radio station, the TV station, the Tour of Utah, the sports park out in Tooele. And so that was kind of what my team was doing there.
Just a few things.
But it was a lot of fun, especially the opportunity to get to understand all of those different businesses and industries. Mm-hmm. And then not too long after that, I got the knock on the door and said, "Hey, let's chat." We're moving our at the time it was our NBA D League team that was up in Idaho, and that's the minor league team for the Utah Jazz. So we're moving it from Idaho down to Utah, and we'd like you to oversee that. And my first thought was, what does that mean? I didn't have a ton of experience there, but I had in my roles, I had enough experience to know all the different aspects that would be involved in that. So I spent the first season, our inaugural season down here in Salt Lake, trying to get things up and running and going, and that also was a great experience. And then this past summer, would have been the summer of 2017, I got the call again, saying, hey, our previous SVP of marketing had left to take a role outside the organization. And they said, hey, well, we're going to go out and we're going to look to hire someone, but we need someone to step in and kind of oversee the team during the summer while we go out and do a nationwide search. And at the time, again, I'd only been with the G League team for a year. And so we all felt it was important for me to stay there and keep things going. But after a couple of months of doing that, partially because of on my pushing and partially because I think I'd proven myself there, they said, well, why don't you stay in this role? So this last year was my first year as senior vice president of marketing for the Jazz. And that's kind of been my 7.5 year history within the Larry H. Miller organization.
I would love to get a call on some of your calls. I mean, it has to be exciting opportunity, maybe daunting, but overall pretty exciting.
For sure. I think the one thing that's been great for me is I do thrive on change. So it's never been too daunting for me. I typically will take a step back and say, what does this mean? And what do I need to figure out? But at the end of the day, it's been great experiences, really good experiences.
Yeah, same. I thrive on change, sometimes to my detriment.
Sure, yeah.
Because those first few months or sometimes first few years, you're like, what did I do?
Yeah, there's been times where I brought it on myself. Yeah.
Now, was there ever any hesitancy to take on the next thing?
Honestly, no. I mentioned that I wanted to be involved in the Larry H. Miller Group. And the reason for that was I had this, I don't know where I got the idea, but I had this thought that if I go in and I can prove myself as just a valuable part of the team and someone that can help, I liked the idea that there were multiple companies. And so I thought, well, maybe after 6-7 years, I might be a little stagnant in a role. Maybe there's an opportunity to move to a different role. I didn't realize that would be 7 different roles in 7 years. But that was, so with each one of those, there really was no hesitancy to say, hey, I'm up for the next challenge.
How would you advise someone who's maybe taking on a role that perhaps they're looking at it like this is I'm going to be in over my head. I'm choosing this, but what is the mindset to go into that?
That's a good question, because there was a kind of a growing up period for me during that. I mean, initially I thought, hey, I've got to come in and I should know this. I mean, I'm responsible for whether it's a new department or a new entity. I should know all of this. But the one thing that I learned, and it took me a little while to figure this out, that it's okay to come in and ask questions, to find different people who have experience in different areas and get that insight and understanding, and that you don't have to know everything. I mean, I look at my role as a leader in a lot of these situations has been to try and come in and figure out how to refine a department, or how to, maybe there's some restructuring that needs to go in that helps provide some additional collaboration or synergy amongst the organization. And that only comes through a little bit of investigative work and finding out what's the root challenges or root causes of some of the problems that we might be encountering.
That makes sense. I've talked to a lot of CEOs, CMOs, COOs, and VPs who have said that, they'll spend upwards of 6 to 12 months just talking and asking questions and finding out like where those employees who have been there for the long haul, they usually have like, here are the pain points. Here's what we need to correct. They have a lot of information.
There's no question about that. And I'll say initially, and when I was put in situations, even in previous organizations when I was back in the real estate industry, I probably didn't take that time to go in and learn from the folks that have a great wealth of experience and institutional knowledge there. But I've learned that, and it makes things a lot easier, because there are a lot of talented people out there. And if you take the time to sit down and ask them for assistance and ask them for their perspective and insight, it's amazing the great ideas that can come out, and you don't feel that pressure on yourself to think, I got to come up with the solution and I got to come up with the problem. I've gotten to the point to where I think very few times now in my career am I really the one that's ultimately end up solving the problem. It's usually a group of people that are doing it.
That's some good insight, because that would take quite a bit of discipline to sit in that space of asking and investigating versus I need to take action in order to look really, really valuable.
For sure.
But it seemed like you had the end game in mind with everything that you were doing. Like, I truly want to do right by this brand and the people within it. Now let's talk about, you have an amazing team. Mm-hmm. We've met quite a few people on your team. They are exceptional. We worked with them. Tell me about kind of onboarding in your situation and pulling it together and just being like, here, I am now the new leader. Yeah. But let's move this together. You bet.
One of the things that I think I've learned over the years is sometimes we get caught up in organizational structure. There's supposedly a perfect org chart for how everything's supposed to align that creates this just dynamic work environment for everything. And sometimes that's the case. But I think more often than not, it's about the individuals that you have on your team and their strengths, and maybe some of their weaknesses that can become strengths for them. And so that's one of the things that I've always tried to do, is try to understand those strengths of the individual team players, and then try to put them in a position where they have a better opportunity to succeed. And as those wins start to accumulate for them, that's when it becomes a little bit easier to maybe stretch them a little bit more. And see how they operate and function in a stretch environment. But part of that is you have to trust them, and you have to make sure you've got people that you can trust. I mean, when I'm interviewing folks, I'm always looking for the technical experience, and I want them to be solid in their knowledge and skill set. But for me, I tend to focus a little bit more on just personality fit with me. As well as with the overall team, because I think that culture and that fit oftentimes can be more powerful than maybe a little edge in technical experience. We all can learn things. We all can go in and improve our technical skill sets, but our ability to communicate, our willingness to collaborate, and our willingness to take criticism at times too, can often be more powerful in the business environment.
We just read the book Radical Candor, and they talk about this need to generate active critical critiques, like that, being able to accept feedback, but you as the leader being able to say, no, you need to be critiquing, including me.
Exactly.
So positioning that
there's
hard.
a great podcast that I just listened to as well, one TED Talk from Adam Grant.
Okay.
And he talks about an environment of a business. I can't remember the specific details on it, but they ended up calling it radical transparency. And there's an instance where everybody, including the top of the ladder there, receives radical transparent criticism. And so there was one experience where there was an employee that sent an email to the CEO after a meeting stating, "Hey, that meeting was an F. You were terrible. It was obvious you weren't prepared. And it was a waste of our time." Mm-hmm. And it created an environment. Now, I'm not suggesting that we do that, and I'm not suggesting that's how it is in our environment. But you can tell that there are folks that thrive on that, and that's something for me. I mean, I'm lucky to have some great mentors, some great friends that have helped me throughout my career, and that's my best way to kind of learn and progress, is to search that out and say, what do I need to do? Early on in my career, it was tough. I don't think I had thick enough skin to do that. But if we as individuals in the workplace are willing to accept constructive feedback and criticism on there, and there's a better way to approach it, I think, than the TED Talk that I'm referring to, then it's amazing how quick some of the barriers can be broken down, and how you can focus on really what your goals and tasks are at hand.
Right. Yeah. I would say that maybe don't send that to the CEO direct. But in that same book, they talk about that having a meeting where it's called a skip level meeting, where you get to meet with someone that's not your direct manager, but the one before that. But it's all a practice. Because it's the habit. And I don't know why we're all so afraid of feedback.
Sure.
I mean, I still kind of clench a little bit when I'm like, I know it's coming. Yeah. I know I need it.
Sure.
Because that's where it opens up the project that I'm trying to put out there in its best iteration. Sure. But I mean, why are we so afraid of it?
It's true. And it's our natural tendency, right? And to your point, I think that's something that I've tried to do later in my career too, with the step, what did you call it? The
skip level
meetings. Is I've finally gotten to the point where I have 5 or 6, I think, direct reports, but I've also got 30 different people that work in my department, and I've made it a point that it's not always easy with schedules, but I've made it a point to meet with every one of them on a somewhat regular basis, and the focus of it is hey, what can we do as a department to be better? What are you seeing? Because sometimes there's a nervousness too to even bubble that, let's not call it criticism, but ideation up through the ranks. And so I think we as leaders owe it to the organization and to our employees to give them an opportunity in a safe environment to say, hey, what can we do better? Because if we're not striving for something better, we're staying stagnant, and it's just not a comfortable place for many of us.
Now let's talk about the Vivint Smart Home Arena, because that's new as of the last couple of years, and you've done a whole remodel. I mean, that massive screen, it's a beautiful, beautiful setup. But even more so is the new guest experience. And I know part of it is a sales, it's spearheaded by sales, right?
Sure,
initiative.
Part of it is, yeah.
But then there's that marketing aspect of, you guys already created a really fun, dynamic, awesome guest experience. But what went into what you unveiled just in the last season or two?
No, it's a great question. And, a lot of people ask, why do you spend $125 million and invest that into Arena, which quite frankly, when you get down to the details, was a very well built building and didn't need a ton of structural improvements or anything like that. But sports and entertainment is changing. What people expect and what the fans expect from those experiences has changed greatly over the last little bit. You talk about the sales side of it. Part of that is a premium experience. There are high demands across all the four major sports for increased premium opportunities. Businesses are becoming aware of the value in being able to entertain clients and leverage some of those experiences into successful business negotiations. And so part of that was driven by, okay, we need to go in and we need to improve that experience, provide a different array of seating options and to cater to all different levels of fandom there. But part of that from our standpoint, and this started even before we ended up doing the renovation, was how do we you can't always control what's going to happen on the court, right? I mean, we may have great players, we may have a team that's competing. Luckily right now we've got a fantastic team, great personalities, but that may not always be the case. But people will still come and want to experience that, not just for what's on the court. Quite frankly, it's becoming more about what's off the court than what's on the court. And so we had employed kind of a research process in this where we had formed a partnership with Qualtrics here, part of Silicon Slopes. Yeah. And we had done set up some research, wanted to do some qualitative analysis on what our fans really wanted. So the key thing started with what they wanted. So we did a year's worth of surveying prior to try and understand what some of the needs were on that. We took that feedback, and that's what drove a lot of the different experiences. We learned that people wanted an opportunity to create memories. I think it's 46% of our attendees come with a child. And so that's a different experience than, four guys or four gals that are going out for a night out on the town that want to get some good food at the arena and have an entertaining time while they can chat and socialize. And so we wanted to create some of those memorable experiences. I think some of those include like the J-Note that we put out on the plaza. The number of people that come early want to make sure that they get their photo in front of that and share that they're there and they're part of, what's so exciting is fantastic. And it's been very well received. And there's areas throughout the entire arena that allow you to, if you want to socialize, there's great opportunities up on in our Ford fan zone. We've got some standing room only up there with drinks and snacks and everything up there, where it's a great environment to socialize, at the same time catch the game. But then there's also the food has become a big component too.
The food is so good. I mean,
Yes.
I remember going to the Hundreds Club, like upstairs, but and it was like all you could eat shrimp and all the good stuff. And then the Ford Club, where it's opened up to more than just that first few rows of seats. And it's gourmet.
Great.
But then you also get the popcorn and the hot dogs. You get anything that you want.
Well, and I think that's the key part too, is we want stuff that appeals to everyone though. There are some of those clubs and those clubs, tickets into those can be fairly expensive. And so that's why we want to do to elevate the entire food experience. And that came from partnering with some of our local restaurateurs here in the Salt Lake Valley. That's bringing in Cubbies. That's bringing in Maxwell's. That's bringing in R&R Barbecue and others. Iceberg Shakes. We consume. What's an interesting fact is being in Utah, we consume. I don't know what the X amount is, but an extraordinarily amount of ice cream, more so than any other place. Now our alcohol sales are down a little bit, but we make that up in ice cream. But that's what people want when they come. They want more than just the on-court experience. And we've tried to give that to them.
And I have friends who they absolutely want to sit in the very top row, the very top seat, the nosebleeds, and that's their experience for them. Yeah. But what I love is that wherever you enter the arena, you can't even take 4 or 5 steps before there's someone there to help you.
Yes.
No matter what seat you have.
Yeah.
And it's impossible, considering the size of it, to be lost.
Sure.
To feel like you're underserved.
Yeah.
To feel like you're not important.
We have one of the greatest guest services staff out there, in my opinion. I've been to a lot of arenas, and they're friendly, knowledgeable, always willing to go out and help, because we want that experience to be unique. What's interesting is a lot of experiences, especially with families with young kids, is Disneyland, right? Y'all dream of that time where you go to Disneyland and you experience everything great about Disney. Well, you can replicate that not only for young kids at that age, but as they start to grow older, we look at that, especially for teenagers. It's not necessarily Disneyland anymore for a 14 and 16-year-old siblings with mom and dad. Their experience is going out to a jazz game, maybe having an opportunity to get an autograph, to go in and get great food, to sit low, to scream and yell with mom and dad and not get yelled at by mom and dad, right? So it's great.
Now, in terms of the history of the Jazz, let's talk a little bit about that, because I think it's interesting. Like, the Utah Jazz did not start in Salt Lake City and started in New Orleans or Nolens, however we want to talk, which Jazz specifically. But let's talk about that path, because it wasn't necessarily a super successful team before we brought it to Salt Lake City, but it was a very intentional decision.
Yeah, it was interesting. I've spent a bit of time, looking over that, because we always, as a marketing department, we always talk about jazz and the roots and how does that play into our overall strategy. But as you said, it wasn't very successful. In New Orleans, it was started in 1974. They were not competitive for 5 years, not competitive at all. And so that's what precipitated the move to Utah. And there was still another 5 years before we were able to make the playoffs in 1984. What was great about that is we didn't miss the playoffs again until 2004. So a nice 19-year run. But I think the key thing there is that what I've learned is the previous owners there recognized that Salt Lake was a pretty passionate community, especially about basketball, and really believed that there was a home there. And I think Larry and Gail Miller took that even to the next level when they became partners with Sam Battistone and wanted to make sure that the Jazz were in Utah to help from an economic standpoint, to help from an employment standpoint. And that's only been proven more and more so when they announced the Legacy Trust this past season, which is probably the closest thing you can get to perpetual ownership remaining in the state. And so I think that, kudos to Gail and the rest of the family for doing making such a huge commitment to the community.
Yeah. Now, in terms of storytelling in the marketing department, I remember my first game, and I was telling you before, it was when Karl Malone still played for the Jazz. I had a seat on the court. He came out to throw a ball in, and I remember looking at his calf, and his calf is the size of my head. Yeah. This is the coolest experience. Yeah. And my first experience of the Jazz was that Stockton to Malone connection. And that's a story. Yeah. That was definitely a story. Not only were they good at playing together, but then you had to market that story. And then Jerry Sloan, was the coach. Since then, there's just been these compelling stories. How do you find those, insulate those, and just kind of wrap that, put it out there? Sure.
Well, that's an interesting one, because what happens with that, at least in my most recent experience, and you're right, most of us, our first experience was Stockton to Malone, and great personalities and great on court. What I've learned over the last little bit is that can change on you very fast. I went into this past season, or our team went into this past season, our planning had been more primarily focused on the overall experience. We wanted to capitalize. Once in 20 years, will you spend $125 million on an arena renovation and focus on how this experience can change for you? And so everything that we'd planned, and we were a little unsure of what the on-court product would be. We had lost Gordon Hayward in the summer before. We knew we had a great personality and potential in a guy like Donovan Mitchell. And we knew from our standpoint internally that we still had the best defensive center in the entire NBA. Rudy Gobert is just that. And so we knew we had some things that we could hang our hat on from that standpoint, but the focus was more so about the experience. Well, you get a bit into the season and that completely changes. Donovan Mitchell becomes a sensation. He scores 41 points. He's in the dunk contest. Rudy Gobert comes back from two unfortunate injuries, and you go on an 11-game win streak. And so in an instant, we have to shift our focus and find ways on how to capture that momentum. And we get, the final 3 months of the season, we just get this great ramp up to the playoffs and people just loving the personality of the players. And that's one thing you have to shift to, not just the on-court, but we've got a team, characters like Joe Ingles, Donovan, Epe Udo, Ricky Rubio. These guys are great on social media and people love it. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've talked internally that, it feels like this chemistry of the team is what's inspiring our fan base. And that's both off and on the court. So how do we capture that? And we just have to be very nimble with that. We have to be staffed appropriately. So much of that's done through video. We've got a great videographer that's able to put stuff together for us on the fly to go out there and highlight and showcase to it. But I've learned in this industry, you've got to be very nimble because things can change very fast.
How do you prepare for that? It's not like you can come up with plan B and C.
Interestingly enough, we do.
Really?
We do. Playoffs were a perfect example on that. We probably had at least 3 alternate plans based on every game's performance. We plan so far out in advance. I mean, you think about the Utah Jazz, and that's probably where, the magnitude of the brand starts to lie on your shoulders and realize that, boy, we've got an entire state that is interested in what's going on with this brand, and they're paying attention to it. And so you have to we go through scenarios, and, my leadership team meets on a weekly basis, and we talk through that. We talk what could come up, what could change, what could happen, and are we prepared to go in and do it? And sometimes we might produce 3 or 4 different videos. Sometimes we're lucky and we get to use all 3 or 4 of them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, 3 of them go in the coffers and we wonder if it'll ever make its way out. But you have to really look always at A, B, and C in this industry.
I feel like you could do a whole workshop on if-then scenarios that would support other industries because of the industry that you're in.
You really could. And that's the fantastic thing about my team too. You can't do it. Just one person thinking of all the if-then scenarios. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think our folks do a great job of, is everybody's always really good at raising their hand and says, but what if this happens? And we shift and we plan and we prepare for that.
Well, let's talk about that shift, because how much do you invest into something versus, what's the checklist for we need to pivot? Mm-hmm. Pivot hard. And if that means we're just not going to air 3 videos that we put a lot of production value and support into.
Yeah.
Kind of walk us through maybe some of those top level things how you make your decisions.
Sure. Well, there's a great example of this past year. We put a lot of money into what we kind of hang our hat on as maybe a singular brand video. And as I stated, that was all based around the arena, the fact that everybody gathers together for the Utah Jazz, which we had planned to roll out in late November, early December. Well, at that point, that was less important. And we had put a lot of time and effort. My director of marketing, which is fantastic, Elena, had put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into that. We had a big TV buy planned, and this is really what we were going to hang our hats on. Well, in talking through that as a group and looking at what else we could do and how we could do it, the consensus was made that, we're going to pull the TV budget. We're not going to go to market with that. We're going to put it out in our digital channels. We're going to let that live, and it might only live for 2 or 3 weeks, but we're going to focus and make our shift on what the fans are demanding. I mean, that's really the challenge, is as much as you plan and prepare, you've got to be willing. And we felt like the plan was fantastic. We loved it. We loved the approach that we were doing. Great collaborative approach, but you've got to be willing to take a step back and say, you know what? I can force this. or I can let the people say, you know what, I'm more interested in this, and you can give them what you want. And so that was a tough decision, and it's really kind of crafted the way that we're going into this year, where we're probably not just going to hang our hat on one different approach. We've got 4 or 5 and series of approaches that we want to go to market with. And so you got to know when to pull off and say, you know what, let's turn. But that's got to be a collective think tank there.
Right.
And my team's great at understanding that, no matter how invested you are in that approach.
Probably be in the nature of just what you guys do, but I think that's good insight, and always that feedback loop. I keep thinking, like, you just have to be gauging all the time, and you have to be willing to cut and make strong pivots where it's like, I did not sleep for this many nights in a row on this project, and know that it's okay. And
there's times where you go and you're like, really? Are we making this decision? This can't be the case. And you do. There were several moments last year where I just wanted to pull my hair out because we'd given so much for something, and it wasn't right. And sometimes I went to the hill and I tried to battle for it, and the proper decision won out, and I backed off on that, and it still works out fine. That's what we have to remember.
But that whole we for me, I mean, that seems to be quite present with you and with your team. Now, in terms of just your management leadership style, Bart, there's an ease about you. You seem just like to have this ease, but I mean, it's high stress, like high stakes, high stress in everything that you do. How do you manage your team to make sure they're thriving? You mentioned putting them in the right positions, but what else do you do?
Sure. I think, especially in this environment, what's great about, many of the folks that we hire and that work for the Jazz is, they're passionate about what they do. People search out and want to be involved in sports. And so I have to worry less about, are you doing your work? Are you putting in enough hours? That's really not even a part of my checklist or what I'm focusing on. Where I feel the most pressure as a leader is, how do I ensure everybody's finding good balance, and how do I ensure there is a positive culture that provides opportunities, one, for a break, but also for an opportunity to take a step back and do some things that you enjoy, because we all do things in the office that we may not enjoy as much, and there's things that we really love to do. And so, for me, in trying to help and support my team, it's really that. It's trying to, I probably don't do a good enough job with it, but I'm always trying to talk to them and find out where they need help and what I can do to help with that. Because sometimes the list stacks up for them, and they need a break. They need a break. I mean, I felt that this year as we got into the second round of the playoffs, and I'm thinking, boy, if we go another round, I don't know how I can keep everybody engaged and going, because it's such a fast pace from one game to the next. But I think the more that I focus on the individuals and how they're finding balance in their work life, and giving them opportunities to do the things that they enjoy in addition to the things that might be a little bit more difficult, I think that helps alleviate a bit of the stress that's out there and typically keeps us a little bit more engaged.
What would you say you would give someone maybe sitting in my seat? Like, well, I have clients, I have like a pretty, business calendar, but how can I create a delightful experience even though I'm not in hospitality? Sure.
I think sometimes we go into that and we think we might be confined or restricted to certain things. My preference on that is, and we have a ton of out-of-the-box options for any business or organization that wants to not only surprise and delight clients, but surprise and delight our employees. Our employees are our greatest asset. If we help them understand and feel appreciated and understand the true value that they bring to us, it's going to save us as individual leaders a lot of heartache and heartburn. And so from our standpoint, and I guess mine specifically, is I'd love the opportunity to sit down and figure out what an individual entity's culture is like. What are you trying to accomplish? And let us come up with solutions for it. That's always been my mantra. You know, I love to think that I come to work with a fire extinguisher on my back and ready to solve problems, put out fires, whatever it is. But you've got to have the conversation about what do we really need to solve for. Sometimes, and again, I've been guilty of this at times where I just come in and say, this is a great one, do it. This is a great one, do it. This is great, do it. And realistically, it's not solving anybody's problem. It's just solving a need that I have on that. And so that would be my recommendation to anyone that's looking, and I would even lean more on the employee side of, if we want to show our employees that they're appreciated. And let's be honest, it is a competitive environment out there. There are a lot of great organizations that are focused on culture, that are focused on employee benefits, that understand the value of retaining good employees. We need to be just as focused on that, regardless of where we're at. But there's always a solution for it. I have yet to meet a problem in any facet of business where we haven't been able to solve a problem. That might have always not been the greatest solution, but we were able to solve to it at some degree or another.
Right, and just not assuming. I think that's what
you can't assume.
Don't assume that you know what they're asking for. Have that crucial conversation and then deliver on that.
Definitely.
And then maybe that emotional intelligence of like, I know that we had one example with a client recently where our campaign manager, you know, the client said something in passing that would be valuable to them. And it was as simple as being verified on Instagram. Yeah. That they had been trying through whatever channels they had to be verified. And they had a pretty large following on Instagram. Sure. And a person on the team picked up on that, didn't even tell the campaign manager that they were doing it, and went all these different routes, got them verified. Yeah. And
anybody can have their ears open.
Yeah.
And again, I think sometimes it might be one of my pet peeves. I don't have too many pet peeves. I'm a pretty easygoing, laid back individual, but one of my pet peeves is not listening to others. Again, I get the, I don't know if it's the stress, but the desire to be ready to give, the best answer or, to have the best solution. But taking a moment to listen, pause, and in some situations, not even have the answer at that point, but say, let me go work on that. You know what? That's great. I understand. I can see that's a hang up. Let me go try and solve for it and come back with the right answer. And I think there's a great amount of value in that.
Bart, that is huge. That is so I started in broadcast journalism, and I've been asked, what are the transferable skills to what I do now? Mm-hmm. And I always say the art of listening. Yeah. Most people think they're really good listeners, but what they're doing is they're waiting for their opportunity to respond. And it's a natural, human.
It is. It's not an easy trait,
right,
to be able to listen.
But that pause, what comes after the pause is usually the good stuff.
My wife will tell you that I'm not that great of a listener. There's some others that might say I do all right.
It's a working craft. We're all working on it.
It's a work in progress.
But acknowledging that, most people just want the opportunity to be listened to. That's super validating.
Very true.
You don't even have to agree with them.
Exactly. But you can learn something from it. Yeah. And oftentimes you start to see the trends from it too, because I do that. I can get defensive when I hear something, and I'm like, that's not true. I didn't do that, or they didn't do that. And then you hear it the second and third time. You're like, you know what? Okay. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Right?
Yeah, the first one, nuh-uh.
Yep.
Oh, okay, maybe.
Yeah.
I can work on that.
There's usually some truth to it.
Now, my last question for you would be around legacy. What do you hope to be remembered for?
Sure. That's an interesting question. I guess for me, my key principles as an individual and as a leader revolve around honesty and integrity. There's a lot of ways that we can find success in life. There's a lot of ways that we can impact, whether that's business, whether that's family, whether that's our community. But for me, honesty and integrity, and someone that carries those traits throughout whatever they do, is pretty critical. I learned this at an early. It was an early lesson for me. My dad, he owned a carpet cleaning business. And at the age of 4, I started going carpet cleaning with him because mom had gone back to work and dad had to take me with him. Mm-hmm. And so I'd go and I'd pull hoses and I'd do whatever I could. And I still remember the day. I can picture the house. I don't know where it is, but I can picture the front door where I had walked out. While I was in there, I had picked up a quarter and I'd put it in my pocket. And somehow, I don't think my dad was in the room, but somehow he knew that I did that. We got out and we put the truck all back together, and we sat in the seats of the van. And he looked over at me and he confronted me on it. And he said, "Sharps don't steal." And he said, "I want you to go. I want you to go back to the front door. I want you to give the money back." And that was scary. I was 4 years old at the time. And he sent me up on my own to this front door. And so I knock on the front door, and he probably prepped the lady and let her know that I was going to do this because she was as sweet as could be. Knocked on it, and I held my hand out and I said, "I'm sorry, I stole the quarter." She patted me on the head and I went my way. From that moment on, honesty and integrity are key. I look for that in others, and I want to be known for that as well.
And I wonder, most people probably think they're honest and have integrity, but it's the decision we make when it's hard.
It is hard.
The hardest to be honest.
Yeah.
Or the little moments of when it's, actually to contradict, it's the easiest to be like, no big deal, it's a quarter.
Yeah.
But to call ourselves on that.
Yeah, it's not easy, but I tell you what, everybody is going to make mistakes. In your careers, you're going to make mistakes. If you're the person that is always defending that and realizing that when that happens, it's okay to realize that, hey, we made a mistake on it. If you're the one that's saying you never made a mistake, then as a leader, you always know that there's something wrong there. Mm-hmm. If you can't admit your mistakes or that something went wrong. But as we do that, I think the level of trust as an individual to our leaders and to the organization, that's where I develop trust and respect for employees is when they're willing to admit that something's gone wrong. And they usually come with a plan. Hey, I messed up, this happened, but here's what I'm going to do to fix it. And if I can get that response, I'm happy as a leader because I expect errors to be made and sometimes things don't go our way. But come back, acknowledge it, and have a plan to make it better moving forward.
That's a powerful story, and we've come full circle with that radical transparency, being willing to admit that, and also that honesty. Yeah. And that integrity. Thank you, Bart. This has been so fun.
This has been great.
Yeah. I appreciate you being involved in the Mastermind Interview Series, and I look forward to more conversations.
Fantastic. Love to do it.